Hello, I'm Ann Bocock, and welcome to Between the Covers. Lori Roy's work is simply stunning. Her stories and her characters will stay with you long after you close the book. Her first novel, Bent Road, won the Edgar Allan Poe Award. Her second novel was a finalist for the Poe Award, and both were New York Times choices. Critics have compared her to William Faulkner and Harper Lee. She's here today with her third novel, Let Me Die in His Footsteps, and I am delighted to have her as my guest. Welcome, Lori Roy.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I want to know what it feels like to be compared to Harper Lee and to Faulkner.
I can honestly say I haven't given that a whole lot of thought, and I fear that had I given it much thought, it would have been quite intimidating.
It would take my breath away.
It does.
If I read that. But let's talk about Southern fiction.
Yes.
I love Southern fiction. I mean, maybe because it is part of my heritage. I am Southern. And I know people always want to pigeonhole an author into a particular genre. I have seen your work called Southern Gothic or American Gothic. Do you see yourself in a particular category?
You know, I never really have. One of the first things I learned as a new writer, I was doing the workshops and the conferences and studying the craft, and I was given the piece of advice: write the book you want to read, and that's really what I have stuck to. I like to read a book that has great characters, a book that is deeply rooted in setting and themes, but I also want a plot that really keeps me turning the pages. And so that's really all I think about when I sit down. I'm liking the feel of the South, so I may be staying in the South for a while, so maybe that Southern Gothic will stick. But so far, no, honestly, I haven't given that.
You know, and I ask only because I've read all three, and I couldn't put them into a particular neat little package and say, this is what Lori writes.
Well, when people ask me, that's one of the first questions you get when you meet someone and then they realize you're an author. I tell them literary suspense.
Okay.
I think, so whether we're in the Midwest as my first book or in Detroit with my second, this one is in Kentucky, they all have those elements in common.
You said you might stay with the Southern thing for a while. What makes Southern fiction so good?
You know, I'm really not sure, but I'm very comfortable there. And the setting, I always start with setting. In all my work, it's been that way. And there are a lot of places in the South that I'm very intrigued by, and I hope to visit in future books.
The new book, in my humble opinion, is the best one yet.
Thank you.
I knew it was going to be good, but then you have that crazy time where you don't want to put the book down, but you also don't want it to end. Thank you.
You're welcome. That would be great on the back of the book. Great line.
You should give a class in how to construct a plot. Maybe you do.
That's a high compliment, thank you.
Because you layer your stories so carefully, so precisely, but yet as a reader it seems effortless. So how do you do this?
I take that as a great compliment, because plot is most definitely the hardest part of the craft for me. And in trying to get better at it, and it is just an ongoing process, I've studied screenplay writing, actually, quite a bit. Screenwriters are very, very disciplined. And if you watch a movie, it's interesting. In about the first 10 minutes, that thing will happen. Have you ever been watching a movie, and this happens with my husband and I all the time, we'll be sitting and watching, and you know, if something doesn't happen in the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to turn this off, especially with Netflix and everything these days. Well, that something is what they call that first plot point. And so I study that. I study films, I study screenwriting techniques, and that has helped with my fiction a great deal, because plot is very important and it's very difficult.
May I ask you to read something from your book?
Absolutely.
And it goes right with what we're talking about, because this is just the 4th paragraph of the book.
Oh,
and this
okay.
is where I went, oh, you've got me.
I'm intrigued. Which one is it?
It starts right here.
Okay. All right, I don't have my reading glasses, so
Okay, I'm
bear
sorry.
with me. I should have brought them. They both have the know-how, Annie and Aunt Juna. That's what Grandma calls it, the know-how. It floats just above the lavender bushes, trickles from the moss hanging in the oaks, drifts like a fallen leaf down the Lone Fork River, just waiting for someone like Annie or Aunt Juna to scoop it or snatch it or pluck it from the air. The two of them share the know-how because Aunt Juna is Annie's real mother. Grandma has it too. She says there's no evil in the know-how, though some are frightened of a thing they know little about. It's my gift to you, Grandma is all the time saying, but that's not true. The know-how passes from mother to daughter. Everyone knows that. Annie also has Aunt Juna's black eyes, not dark brown or almost black, but black through and through. Folks believe that's where the evil lives, in the eyes. It's Annie's fear, has been all her life, that evil passes from mother to daughter too.
So I read that. That's the 4th paragraph, and I went, okay, that's it. Nothing else is going to happen in my life until I continue. This story alternates between 1936 and 1952,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
And you have really 2 stories, and what's fascinating to me, one is told in the first person, and the other is told in the third person. How you did that so seamlessly, that had to be difficult.
It was very difficult. I would say I spent about 6 months on the first 50 pages of this book, and that was just fleshing out the voices. It's once the characters start to bubble up, I find it more a process of figuring out what happened as opposed to deciding what will happen. That's a subtle difference, but it's almost as if it's really happened, and you just have to find that right note.
You knew the story, though, before you started writing.
No.
Really?
No. I knew one thing. Annie, that's the protagonist that we were listening to there. Annie's 15 and a half years old when the novel begins. And there is a tradition that at 15 and a half, a girl will go at the stroke of midnight and look into a well, and there she'll see the face of her intended. And I knew, the only thing I knew about Annie is that she was bound and determined to look into that well at midnight and by summer's end, kiss the boy that she saw there. I didn't know why she was so determined, but I knew she was determined. So I spent a lot of time writing and searching for that motivation, and once I found it, I knew Annie. And then much of the rest bubbled up.
It is a coming-of-age story in many respects. 2 coming-of-age stories.
Yes. We have Annie in the front story in the 1952. She's 15 and a half. And in the back story, we have her sister, or her mother, when she is about the same age as Annie is in the front story.
And
have I lost everyone there?
No, but and I thought, as saying that out loud, you would think the reader would be so terribly confused, and you're not.
Well, I hopefully did a few things to keep that straight, because I know it's frustrating as a reader. I've been in that position. Each chapter is a different point of view character, and it's always important in these situations that each storyline have its own arc, and hopefully I have accomplished that.
It's not just a coming-of-age story. There are a lot of secrets in these families. They're desperately trying to survive in this county in Kentucky that is so hard.
Yes. It was a challenge to me, and people kind of laugh when I say this, but so I write Gothic suspense, as we've talked about, Southern Gothic, and some people have called my writing noir, again, a darker, grittier fiction, and I chose to set this book on a lavender field, on a lavender farm.
And I loved that.
Well, there's not much particularly dark or Gothic about a lavender farm. That is nearly in full bloom in June. And so to conjure suspense and that gritty plot line amidst this lavender field, that was a challenge to me as a writer, and hopefully I've found my way there.
So just look at the gorgeous cover.
It is a beautiful cover.
She's in a field of lavender. Did the inspiration for this story that's in the book actually come from real events?
There is a part of the book, and I'm very careful to say loosely inspired by the last lawful public hanging that took place in the United States. That took place in 1936 in Kentucky. So the backstory line where I talked about Annie's mother being the protagonist, that takes place in 1936. And I say very loosely because I have not followed the circumstances of the actual event intentionally. There are certain aspects of it which I was very intrigued by, and they're very, very significant to the book. So it's a rather small part of the novel, but extremely significant, I think, to the heart of the work.
We spoke about this briefly in that your writing details such a sense of place. Place is as if it was a character in your book, in this one, Kentucky, on the lavender farm. I honestly felt like it should be like a scratch and sniff book. So,
I've heard that everywhere I've gone.
Really?
And so I need a spray bottle.
You
do?
Do?
Like lavender scent, and I can sign it and spray it.
The other thing that you do across the board is great female characters. And I think you really enjoy this hint of madness.
I do. I do enjoy a character who's a little bit, let's just say it, a little bit crazy.
A little bit.
I think we all are a little bit crazy at some point in our lives, given the right circumstances and the right stresses. And I do like writing. They're strong female characters, but I think they're very typical female characters. I think women are often the backbone. They're not always in the glamorous positions, particularly in the time I tend to write in the past.
There's not many glamorous women in this one.
They're not glamorous, but they're very strong. They make hard decisions, and I'm very intrigued by that. I'm interested in exploring those character traits.
What was fascinating to me is there is a 16-year difference in the two stories that do come together. Did you have to tweak anything at all to make the characters play differently? There's a couple of the characters overlap.
Yes, they do, and they're very different worlds, because in the 1936 world, we are still in the world of tobacco farming for both the families that are involved. And one of the tobacco farms is not very successful. And in the front story, we're on a lavender farm, which is a very beautiful place with lots of light and hope, ultimately in the end. I always like to have hope. In the back story, where we have the struggling tobacco farm, there's a house that lays forever in the shadows. Things never dry out. They have to hang their socks up year-round because they never dry out. So I think there is a very significant difference between the two, and yet they're in the same location, just 16 years apart.
Was there a challenge in having a character who at one point is in this coming-of-age story and has had to make some very serious life decisions, and then in the other story, she has grown up? Even though she's only 15, 16 years older, she has very much grown up.
It was a struggle, because it was a struggle, but it was what was interesting to me. Because in the backstory, I believe you're talking about Sarah,
Yes.
who is Annie's mother. She is, I guess, suffering the consequences of her childhood or young adulthood decisions. So to see her living in the aftermath of those decisions, and at the same time in the backstory, we're realizing exactly what happened to her to result in her behavior in the front story.
And I love how you don't just lay it out there. It's like peeling an onion to get to the actual inner story. There are 3 generations in the book, and as you captured this family drama, as a reader, I'm thinking you really care for these people.
I do very much so. It's a process. I mentioned Annie. Knowing that Annie was bound and determined to kiss this boy by the end of the summer, but I didn't really know Annie until I suddenly realized why. And once I knew why she had to kiss that boy, and it was a very specific reason, I knew her, I knew everything I ever needed to know about Annie. And I went through the same sort of process for each of the each of the characters, even small minor characters, have to have that arc, have to have that motivation, they have to have a desire for something. And it's uncovering that is what I find fascinating about the process. And they do come alive and they stick with me. And I feel bad when I was recently doing a book club on Bent Road, which was my first book, which came out like 2011, and I forget names. And then I feel guilty, I feel bad, like I need to go back and I can't forget names, and because they are near and dear.
The characters become very nuanced. Not at first, I wanted more and more, and then you're baiting me, and I get a little more as I'm reading it. Are you telling me you don't outline ahead of time, that you know every single characteristic that Annie had and Sarah and no?
I don't. I wish I did.
I'm surprised.
And I've done some teaching, and I recommend that to writers who are studying that they give it a try. Because it would save a lot of time. But so if you're a writer and it works for you, I highly recommend it. It just doesn't work for me. I have tried it because it's more uncovering who they are than deciding who they are. It's like tuning an instrument. I've equated it to that. You know, you pluck that string and you roll the little peg on the guitar. I don't even know what they're called, and you just keep plucking it until you finally hear it.
And then you know when you've heard it.
And I know, and I can't tune an instrument, but I think I can hopefully find that right note with a character.
To write this kind of book, you have to be incredibly disciplined. Well, we know you don't outline, but what's your process?
I pretty much write every day. When a book's out recently, I have to cop to it. I'm not writing every day right now, but about 1,500 words a day when I'm writing first draft. And then I spend a lot of time editing.
I think people might be surprised to know you were not always an author. You had a different career path.
You're going to bring that up.
I'm sorry.
I was a tax accountant, of all horrible things. No, it was a great profession. Yes, I was a tax accountant.
You have to be disciplined in that?
You do have to be disciplined. We worked ridiculously long hours right out of college when I was in public accounting. So if nothing else, I got a lot out of it. I can do my own taxes. Not a lot of people can say that.
I'm fascinated by the journey. Did you have a mentor? At what point did you decide, I'm not going to be adding and subtracting anymore, I'm going to write?
Well, I started writing when I had only my son at the time. He was 3 years old, and I wanted to stay home with him. I was a tax accountant. I worked at Hallmark Cards in Kansas City. And I wanted to work toward developing a career that I would have when one day my kids grew up and left me. And now my son has grown up and left me. He's off to college, and I've got another one who's leaving me in a year. And now I have a career. It took me about 10 years of working on the craft. And then, I wrote Bent Road, and I was fortunate to find an agent pretty quickly because there's no magic to knowing that a book is ready to be published. So fortunately, I came across a great agent, and I've worked with the same publishing house and the same editor with all 3 books, and they've been wonderful to me.
Most of us read for pleasure. Do you read, when you read someone else's work, with a critical eye? Do you think, oh, either I would never have written that, or I wish I had written that?
Yeah, the wish I had written that is when I love a book. And if I find myself reading and not being critical or thinking, not even critical, but when I find myself not analyzing the book, then it's a good book and I get lost in it. And I'll usually know that by about the first paragraph. There are writers who just have an ear for the language, and I start and I think, oh, this is going to be good.
That is describing your own books. You have an ear for the language.
Well, thank you.
When you're writing, do you also read, or do you stay away from other books?
I do read, and I read a lot of nonfiction in research.
Okay. I'm sure you had to research for this book.
Yes, I did. I did both reading. I interviewed several people who lived in Kentucky during this time, who worked at tobacco farms. And that's a great part of the process. I love the research.
I want to know if you have lavender growing in your yard now.
You know, well, I do. It's struggling. I live a little south of here, West Central Florida, and it's a little wet here. At least it was. Now that it's drying out, maybe my lavender will be happier, but it's limping along.
I figured you had to have some.
Yeah, I had
You know,
to.
we talked just briefly, it's not easy for an aspiring writer. I think you have to get a break somewhere along the line, and I'm sure you get questions from people who have written a book or are writing a book. What's the best advice you ever got?
Write the book you want to read. Write the book you want to read. Most of us as new writers, we write the book we want to write. We play into our strengths. My strength was language when I started writing, so I was writing things that maybe the language was beautiful, but nothing was happening. And that was pointed out to me early on, and that's when I learned the value and the importance of plot. And that was the turning point for me.
And dialogue, where does that fit into this?
Dialogue is very important. The funny thing about dialogue is it is the illusion of real dialogue. It isn't actual. The way that we talk naturally, if you were to just transcribe it, would be terrible dialogue. Again, it's having an ear for it and edit, edit, edit.
And you have to change it depending on where your book is set.
Yes.
You had, and in Kentucky, in this very rural part of Kentucky, where did you get that dialogue?
In part, it was interviewing people who lived in various parts. I did a lot of research on various dialects. And then I was careful. I didn't want to turn it into a caricature of what we think of as the Southern dialect. I wanted to be very careful with that. And people even living in the same town will have different dialects and different tendencies, largely based on the family that they grew up in. So all those things were a factor.
I think your books are screaming to be on the big screen. Would this be a double-edged sword? Because I know I think it would be great to see a movie, but then you do give up your baby.
Well, this baby will never change. The book is mine, and I would be a thrilling thing to see. I'm sure any author's thrilled to see their book, and the book will never change. So, you've written 3. Yes.
Do you have a favorite, or is that like saying which one of your children is your favorite?
Oh, yes, it is saying which of your children is your favorite. There are things I love about each of them. I honestly couldn't pick a favorite, but this is the one you want to run out and buy.
This is the one you want to run out and buy. Have you changed as an author from Bent Road to the new book?
I think I'm slightly more efficient. I understand a few things about, for example, getting a good foundation at the beginning of the book is very, very important. And if you get those first 50 to 75 pages right, the rest of it is more likely to kind of talk to you. Things will happen more easily. So hopefully I'm a little smarter, but it does not get any easier.
It doesn't?
No.
Even after success?
No. It's a tough gig, but it's one I'm happy to have. No, it doesn't get any easier.
What do you like to read? You said you read nonfiction when you are writing. In fiction, what do you like?
Lately, I've been reading a lot of Southern writers. I've been rereading a lot of Flannery O'Connor. Just read Toni Morrison's new book. I love everything that comes from Toni Morrison. Pat Conroy is one of my favorites. So I read some crime fiction. I don't tend to read procedural crime, as in the detective PI crime fiction. But I read a very broad spectrum of things.
And now, when the kids have left, you're going to have all this time to write. So you may be getting out books more often.
Well, that would be a good thing to aspire to.
You are, I assume, have in your mind what the next one will be.
I have started the next one, and I'm going to North Florida. And this will be my first stab at a contemporary novel set in the present.
Wow, you really are stepping out there. Okay. We hope you're not going to leave this behind, though.
No, it'll be in the same literary suspense, Southern Gothic.
Your kids read your books.
My kids do not read my books. Neither of my kids have read my books. One of my daughter's friends recently told me she was going to read this for her AP Lit class. So I said, well, you can take me for show and tell.
Okay.
So at least I've got that. My kids to date have not.
Well, when they find you in the bookstore,
One day they will.
You know, it is, to me, such a pleasure to read your books. Your pace is just spot on, and that I want to thank you for, because it's rare to find a book, as I said, that it seems effortless. It's so easy to read, but then I will go back and I will reread that sentence and go, wow.
Oh, that's nice.
I mean, it's just beautiful.
That's nice.
I hope that you speed up the pace so that the next one will come out
I'm trying.
soon.
Trying.
There are some quiet moments that somehow manage to be intense at the same time. I'm such a fan of yours. The book is Let Me Die in His Footsteps. My guest has been Lori Roy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
I'm Ann Bocock, and for more of the story, tune in next time to Between the Covers.